let's start with Qantas, shall we? One of the most used but polarising businesses in Australia. This week, it heralded an incredible year of recovery with an underlying profit close to $2.5 billion. It's astonishing after $7 billion worth of losses in the previous 3 years, and that was around 11 weeks from bankruptcy as the pandemic stopped it flying. Well, that record profit was driven by its cost cutting, high loads on its planes and elevated ticket prices. So now Qantas has to deal with the accusation that it's deliberately thwarting competition to keep those profits flowing. So let's concentrate here on one of its most important routes, shall we? In August, the route between Sydney and Melbourne was the 5th busiest in the world. In that month, it had a capacity of more than 811,000 seats. It was exceeded only by 2 flights in Japan, one in Vietnam, and the busiest of them all, from the Korean island of Jeju to Seoul. For business, for tourists, the route is vital, Sydney to Melbourne. But equally vital is that all flights get away on time with no delay and no cancellations. But in the first 6 months of this year, almost 2,300 flights were cancelled on the Melbourne-Sydney route. That's less than last year when COVID disrupted staff numbers at the airports and at the airlines. Of alarm is that it's 600 more than the 1,700 flights cancelled in the same period before COVID happened. Now, the Bureau of Transport says in July, cancellations on the route, 8.7%, are equal to the highest in Australia. More than 1 in 11 flights is cancelled. You also need to understand something else, and that's called the 80-20 rule. You see, airlines must use each of their slots 80% of the time, or they lose them. And that's led to allegations that airlines bid for lots and lots of slots, then deliberately hoard them to block out the competition. The allegation goes that they cancel flights on an organised rolling basis to ensure the slots are not lost. But competition, like startup Bonza say, just can't get in. Now, this has created enormous friction between Sydney Airport and the airlines, most notably Qantas. The airport says Qantas and others deliberately cancel flights. Qantas says the airport's a monopoly, that it wants more airlines flying to make even more money. Well, this week, Qantas Chief Executive Alan Joyce launched a spirited defence of his airline's practices. So let's just analyse that point by point, shall we?
Air Services' latest report, they said that 20% of all delays in the major capitals were because of their shortages of manpower. So that has an impact. Weather has an impact. And in fact, if you go to Sydney in June, 17 of the 30 days of June, the arrival rates in Sydney were reduced and restricted, 17 of 30 days.
Now, what Alan Joyce says there is true. There were 17 days impacted by weather. But Business Weekend has discovered that of the unaffected days, 13 days in June, there were still 127 cancellations on that Sydney to Melbourne route.
In fact, the arrivals per hour is planned at 50 an hour. It's typically operating at 38 an hour in Sydney. That's a huge problem because we have the aircraft, we have the people to fly those 50 arrivals, and all airlines do, and we're having to cancel because it's something that's out of our control.
And look, yes, there are often things that are out of the airline's control. The issue here is when the situation is normal. Say like April this year, when almost 50% of all flights were cancelled on days that otherwise had no issues at all.
There are very well-respected worldwide rules on it, which gives people a requirement to actually operate the slot 80% of the time. If it's not, then we lose the slot. We're actually operating the slots at Sydney Airport to 92% of the time, and we've been handed back 99% of the slots each scheduled season. We could lose them if we didn't operate them.
But even think about that. Even 92% of flights getting away means 1 in every 12 and a half flights is cancelled. Seeing as the 80-20 rule doesn't include weather inclement events, you do wonder whether it should be tightened. You say to a 90-10 rule just to open up more slots.
The underlying premise on this is that somehow this is blocking competitors getting slots, and that's just wrong. Rex filed for and got 108 peak slots this season. Peak slots. Bonza have not applied for slots in Sydney, so I don't know how they can complain that they haven't gotten slots because that hasn't happened.
All that said by Alan Joyce, Business Weekend understands Qantas has 45,000 slots on that Melbourne-Sydney run. Bonza has said it'd like to access capital city slots. Rex might have even gained some more slots, but it certainly would have liked a whole bunch more.
What we are getting is a very monopolistic airport making a case out for them to try and use the slots for other purposes and trying to improve their profitability, which I can say, these airports in Australia have the highest profitability of any airports in the world. We're making a 13.5% margin, I think.
Operating margin.
Operating margin. The airports are making, before they were privatised, before they went into private hands, were making margins of 40%.
Now, Alan Joyce is right. The airports are highly profitable, but the travelling public will only be well served if the airport is working close to its maximum capacity and that there's competition on all the routes all the time to keep the consumer prices as low as commercially possible.
Is Qantas doing something that is completely incorrect? If we have the aircraft, we have the crew, and we're publishing a slot that we have every intent to operate, and then air traffic control, weather, or technical difficulties mean we have to stop it, that's a completely legitimate reasons for us to cancel flying, and that's the only reason we cancel flying.
The real answer here is that Qantas and other airlines, plus Sydney Airport, should be open to a forensic examination about the use of landing slots, of the deemed maximum capacity of the airport, and of course competitors' willingness to land and to compete. After all, that is the one sure thing that will bring down airfares to more affordable levels. Well, this week, Alan Joyce will front a Senate committee on the cost of living, where no doubt he will face many of these questions again. So stand by. This fight is not over, not by a long shot.